Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Sabater. I'm the Publications VP for the UWA International Law Society, and we're here doing another interview with someone who's in the field of international law to get their gauge on their career and any advice. So it's going to be a really good chat. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're both meeting on today, and would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Before we get started, I just want to introduce Pranami Mandalawata. She is an International Humanitarian Law Advisor at the Australian Red Cross, where she is responsible for engaging with the government and the legal profession on all things IHL, or International Humanitarian Law. Before that, she's worked in international law in government and private sector as well. So thanks so much, Pranami, for joining the UWA International Law Society.
Thanks for having me.
So could you give us a sort of a rundown of your career so far, and what was your journey to getting to your position now?
Sure, thanks, Caroline. Well, I feel like my career has kind of been like a tasting plate of international law in a sense. Like, I've been lucky enough to work in like the international humanitarian law and international security space in like the public, private and not-for-profit sector. And I feel like it's given me like a real broad view of like the different players in the space and like how they engage in international law from like very different perspectives, but like essentially the same topics. So that's been really interesting. So I guess like when I started all of this, I was finishing my law degree at UTS in Sydney, and it was like really commercial focused when I was there. And I was like wondering what kind of other, law fields there are to practice in. And I was like, you know what, international law sounds pretty interesting. Let's see what's out there. And to be honest, the first thing I did was I just like tried my luck applying for like a bunch of UN internships. Like I just went on to like the UN careers website, went on the internships tab and just like applied for a bunch. And I was just like lucky enough to get an internship at The Hague in the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals. So it's a mouthful, but yeah, it was working at the Appeals Council in the Office of the Prosecutor, working on prosecuting international crimes committed in the armed conflict in the former Yugoslavia. So that was only like a 3-month internship, but I think it was like a real eye-opener for me in terms of what like my passions were. And I guess it really showed me that the role international law can play in like not only accountability, but ensuring compliance in areas where like domestic laws and systems might not be sufficient. So I was like, yes, this is probably something that I want to try and pursue. So whilst I was there, like as I was nearing the end of it, I was like frantically Googling. I'm like, oh no, I've got to go back to Australia and I got to have a job. So I was like Googling public international law jobs in Australia. And the main ones I actually found were in government. So there were lots for like government agencies in defense, DFAT, and the Attorney General's Department. They have like different international law and policy sections. So I thought I could give this a go. So I applied for a grad program in both Defence and Attorney General's Department, and I got into the grad program at the Attorney General's Department. So like a year later, I moved to Canberra and I did the grad program for a year, and I eventually got into the Office of International Law. They call it OIL at the Attorney General's Department. So they're like one of the few agencies within Australian government that like advise on international law compliance for like all of federal government. And how they work is they have about, I think, 6 different, we call them like practice groups, and they cover like the breadth of international law. So that's like IHL, international criminal law and international security law, human rights and refugee law, law of the sea and environment law, and like trade and investment. So like literally like everything you can think of, right? And then, so when you work there, you often are involved in like 2 or 3 practice groups. So I was there for like 3 years, and I think I worked across like the IHL and security space, in the cyber law space, and the human rights and refugee law place. So like I guess a broad cross section of like different international law experiences, and the things that you're like exposed to there are like really varied. So like I would be advising on like international law obligations and compliance issues relating to like government national security laws and policies, operations and military deployments. And I guess in addition to that, I'd be dealing with like international treaty negotiations and like working on international conferences and UN processes. So it was really like, as like a young professional starting out in the international law field, it was like a really great way to be like doused in all of the different types of like ways you can engage, I guess, in the international law and relations field. So that was like really useful. And whilst I was working there as well, I was doing my master's in international law. So I feel like I was like trying to just get all like my knowledge and experience embedded, like as I started out. So I guess, yeah, that was like really useful and like a really good springboard, I think, into a career in international law, especially in Australia, because I think it's a bit more limited, I think, in Australia, like the opportunities available. And I think government is like a great way to start. So once I did that, I think then the like pandemic hit. And so I was kind of like, I want to move back home. I wanted to like work in Sydney. So I was like back to my frantic Googling. I was like public international law jobs in Sydney. And once again, like I think international law jobs are a little rarer in like places other than Canberra. But I found this like really obscure like criminal defense firm, like a boutique criminal defense firm in Sydney that like works like mainly in criminal defense, but also with like some sort of international law aspects. So like I applied there, and so completely shifted from like being a government lawyer to being like a criminal defense lawyer, right? But yeah, we worked on like lots of cross-border investigations on like anti-money laundering, corruption, tax issues, and like tangentials to that, we would work on like international crime cooperation, so things like mutual assistance and extradition. And so as part of that, we would look at like international treaties and how they like work with domestic law. So there was a lot of international law in that regard. And we also sometimes advise like states on how like international criminal treaties and domestic criminal treaties like interact and stuff. So once again, it was like a completely different player, and we just engage in international laws in like a completely different way and with different sort of aspects in mind. So yeah, that was like my private sector experience, I guess. And then so as I was working there, this job advertisement for Australian Red Cross came up as an IHL legal advisor, and I was like, oh, I need to apply for this job. This sounds like incredible. And I'd actually worked with Australian Red Cross when I was in government on like a lot of IHL initiatives, actually with the person whose role was being advertised. So I was like, oh, I kind of feel like I know what they're about, like what they do with government in the IHL regard. And so I guess, yeah, here I am. Yeah.
That's great. That's such an amazing journey to your current position. I mean, that's so cool. I mean, I think everything you've done is incredible, like the type, even just like the breadth of international law that you've been able to work in, both in public and private. It's really, really cool.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was just like, sorry, I was just like, I think like it's hard to see like what kind of opportunities are out there. And I think it was like all the random Googling and like going into rabbit holes really helps you find like these obscure like jobs that you wouldn't know. So I would highly recommend that.
Oh yeah, I agree. I have to do the same as well. You've got to really use those research skills to find the obscure places on the internet.
Yeah.
Most definitely. Wow, that's amazing. So with such an amazing career, is there a typical day, or what would a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a typical day, but like so how our team works at Australian Red Cross is that we have like an IHL department, and then we have like a few different IHL advisors who are responsible for engaging with like different stakeholders. So we've got people that like work with the humanitarian sector or with the academic and private sector, with militaries, or I think with the general public. And so my role is to engage with the government and the legal sector and courts as well on all things IHL. And it's really weird when I didn't know about this role before I worked in government. I just thought like Australian Red Cross did like, emergency services, blood donation, but we actually have like such a broad role, as you would know, Caroline, as well, right? In working in humanitarian services. And it's actually like in Australian law under the Royal Charter that like our organisation works as auxiliary to public authorities in humanitarian services. And part of this is helping ensure respect for IHL. So we kind of work like hand in hand with government sometimes to try and like improve IHL best practice and implementation in Australia. So my role is kind of about, I don't know, like I feel like sometimes I'm in like strategy mode, being like, okay, so what can we do to improve IHL practice in Australia? How can we influence government? Sort of, and then going from the sort of planning stage to conceptualization to like implementation. So you're like doing like a whole like kind of a project management and advocacy kind of role. And then sometimes I'm doing like IHL training, government or lawyers as well, to help disseminate sort of the IHL rules. Sort of other times, I guess I'm like doing like being part of like bilateral meetings with government, advocating for specific humanitarian issues that are happening in various conflicts across the world. And so, yeah, like I feel like the topics are so wide-ranging as well. It like really depends on sort of the various humanitarian crises we're facing, right? So it could range from like protection issues, refugees and displacement, to things like sanctions, nuclear weapons, like even cyber warfare, right? So it's like, it's all kind of encompassing, and yeah, it's hard to think of a typical day, I guess.
I suppose that's a good thing. It's always interesting and keeps things fresh. Yeah, I think that is definitely the nature of IHL. It's always changing, and there's always something new happening. But yeah, like you said, you sort of are able to utilize a lot of that international law stuff, but the context of why you're using it, like it's being applied, definitely changes, which keeps things interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So sort of going into that, obviously, at least I think you have a very exciting job. What is the most exciting part, and maybe what is the most mundane part?
So I would say like both the challenging and rewarding part of my job is sort of looking at where the humanitarian issues and needs are, and the role like that our organization can play in bringing these issues to front and center of like not only government, but like the legal sector, the humanitarian sector, the public, and working, I think, mutually on ways forward on like however meaningful of an impact we can have, just like trying to figure out our role and trying to figure out what help, if any, we can have on like helping alleviate suffering, caused by like all of these armed conflicts. I think it's sort of like, for me, conceptualizing it as exciting is a bit strange, because I'm like, oh, we're dealing with like, human suffering, in crises and armed conflicts. So I think seeing it as like a challenge to be like overcome and working together on those aspects is like a good way of conceptualizing it. So it really, I think, just thinking about like practical issues, and not only just thinking about how the law applies, but how, like in practice and in operation, how we can bring this like framework of like IHL, which is basically, protections afforded to people who aren't fighting in an armed conflict, and the laws that sort of regulate how wars are fought, like how to bring it like down from the legal space into the like, these are the things that like people suffering war are facing every day. How can it have a practical impact, and how can we use the law to, I suppose, improve humanitarian outcomes? So I think that's really the most rewarding part. It's very broad, I guess. And I guess the mundane part really is just like every other job, all the admin stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, that's always the case. All the paperwork.
Yeah.
Probably can go into sort of how university, you mentioned that you were have a law degree and also a Master's of International Law. Obviously, you can tell how that has affected your career. But was there anything during university or sort of your early career outside of perhaps education that really helped you in this role or in all your roles? So experience, whether it was internships or gaining skills, things like that.
Yeah. So I think in uni, like especially in my undergrad, it was really about like learning those like basic skills, like, you know, legal research, analysis, framing advocacy and like advocacy strategies as well, as opposed to like the actual international law content, I guess. And it's about like, yeah, using your research to like have a plan of action, have a point, and like sort of trying to pursue that, right? So I guess my master's course, it was more about the subject specific stuff, but I think it was like mainly, yeah, so in terms of like academics, I guess that was it. But like another thing I learned in uni was about like the importance of networking and sort of accounting for diverse perspectives in like your output, like your research, your legal analysis, whatever it is, right? Another thing I learned, I think, in uni is that, especially in international law, like there's no like one answer, right? And because everything is so like linked with like politics and international relations and other issues, like, yeah, you could have like the most perfect legal analysis in the world or like the most sound judgment and logic, but like the practicalities of a situation is that that just won't work, or you won't get every player agreeing to this and things like that. So I think understanding the diversity of perspective is really useful. And in terms of like outside university, I think the most important thing I learned was like diplomatic skills, and an understanding of like how states interact in this field. So I think my government experience helped a lot, and especially because international law is all about like state relations and how they respond to things, how they comply with their obligations, a bit of appreciation of why states do it and how, and the best way to engage with them as well, I think is really useful. So in terms of like diplomacy as well, I think that goes in hand in hand. So at like Australian Red Cross, we engage in what we call like humanitarian diplomacy when we're engaging in like engaging with external stakeholders basically, and that's kind of like a principled way on how we like engage with others. We abide by these things that we call the 7 fundamental principles, and the most relevant, I guess, to my role is like the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. So that's about how we deal with external stakeholders when we're engaging in advocacy. So we don't take sides in conflict, issues of politics, or like other controversies or debates. And we focus like purely on the humanitarian needs. So that's kind of like a form of diplomacy where we just like are not engaging in the politics. We're here on the side of humanity. We're advocating for humanitarian issues. And that's how we seek to influence. So like there are different ways, I think, of diplomacy, and that's not the only way you can do it, right? States engage differently, other organizations engage differently. So that was a really useful skill. And yeah, understanding how states work in this space is like fundamental in my opinion.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you wanting to get into international law, you went and applied for a UN internship. Be really interesting to know, because the UN internships do have a bit of a reputation for being quite competitive. I suppose, what was that process like, and what do you think was what got you to that point in going overseas? And yeah.
So here's the thing, right? Everyone says it's super competitive, and I had the exact same view. Like, to the extent that I was not going to apply. I was like, there's no way I will get this internship, right? So I didn't apply. But I was like, you know what have I got to lose? I tried my luck, right? And I kid you not, like, so I applied, and then a few months later, I literally got an email being like, do you want to come to The Hague? Right? So there wasn't like an interview, there wasn't anything. Like, I didn't even have any indication they were considering me, right? I actually thought it was a scam, to be honest. So I was like, there's no way, right? But like, when I think back on it, I was like, maybe like the UN doesn't have time to interview like every intern to see, you know, to see. So like, I don't know if the processes have changed, but when I applied, which was like, I think 6 years ago, that reputation was still there. And I was like baffled by the fact that like, it was easier than I thought it would be. So I think the idea that it's competitive should definitely not like stop people from applying. And I think another aspect is that like, because the internships are unfortunately like unpaid, that I think that unfortunately precludes some people from like going on these like trips, right? So like, I was fortunate enough to have a scholarship at uni that I could use for this, but like for others, it's a bit more difficult, right? So, but if like financial issues aren't necessarily a barrier, I would just recommend like anyone apply, just because I don't know if it is as difficult as people assume. That's all.
Yeah, you're right, because I think there is that reputation, especially when applying, it can be quite daunting, you know, because I would think you would be competing with not just people, say in Australia, but usually all over the world for an internship. And just like the numbers of that is people in other countries. And sometimes they may prefer certain people from certain countries as well, depending on their, I suppose, the opportunity. But that's a really interesting thing for you to say, that there is that facade of this is too competitive and it's too much. Yeah, I think just trying, because you never know sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what advice would you give, say, students or early career individuals who are interested in getting maybe more into international law or international humanitarian law, or just similar field to you, even with whether it be government or public sector? Is there more experience that they should be working on, or education, things like that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a combination of both, right? Like, so for a lot of international law jobs, like a master's in international law is not necessarily a prerequisite, but it's like desired. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend that like you do it straight off the bat as an undergrad, because like there's plenty of opportunities, I think, to get experience before that as well. So I think like pursuing both is a good idea, but like either or is also good. So in terms of like, other than UN internships, which are unpaid, I think there's like plenty of avenues for like law students as well. One site I would definitely recommend is on Twitter. There's like, what are they called? Are they called pages? Like, I'm so like not a Twitter person, so I don't know what they're called.
Twitter page? I think so.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, there's this group called International Legal Jobs on Twitter, and they tweet like only paid jobs for like junior to mid-tier like professionals, like in their so early to mid-career. So they have like internships, remote opportunities, actual jobs and contracts. So that's also always a useful site to like look up. I wrote down a list because I know there was like a bunch of stuff that I wish I'd known that I wanted to talk about as well. So in terms of, okay, so more local opportunities, right? So Red Cross, as you know, has like our volunteer IHL advisory committees across like all states and territories, as well as like associated community speakers networks and community engagement networks. And their role really is to work on IHL dissemination to the public, right? So you guys host events, IHL trainings and things like that to the public And so there is a bit of a recruitment process if you want to be involved in those, but they have like different members, and you can really get involved in lots of different IHL activities if that's something you're interested in. And I think volunteering roles are a really good gateway to like a career in the field as well. Got more on my list. Let me just check. So, okay, at uni, you should obviously talk to your international law professors, join university international law societies, like you're a part of the International Law Society, right? At
Yeah.
UWA. Yeah, so that's always like a useful in as well. And so outside of unis, I would recommend reaching out to people that you might know in the international law field. Like, feel free to reach out to me, honestly. Like, I'm always happy to chat. And I think a lot of people are, and you should never assume that like they're too busy or they don't want to chat, because like, I think we were all in that position once, right? So we're happy to like talk to anyone. In terms of other things, there's lots of like outside of uni associations as well. You've got like the International Law Association of Australia, the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law, and Young Australians in International Affairs. Those are also like really good networks to be involved in, and they often have like job postings as well, which can be really useful if you're looking for different career opportunities. And they also have different opportunities to like go to events or speak at events or network with people, so that's also good as well. I think in terms of like more local like jobs, like careers in government, joining grad programs is really useful. Like I said, Attorney General's Department, Defence, DFAT are like the three main bodies that deal with international law, but you can also look at like Home Affairs, Prime Minister and Cabinet, and AFP as well. There's like a bunch of different government agencies you can look to as well. Academia and think tanks I have like a little less experience in, but that's also like different avenues as well, right? And you can also look at like missions in Australia. So job opportunities at embassies, and even like the ICRC have a mission in Australia, and they have like some junior regional legal advisor positions that pop up from time to time as well. So I'd keep a lookout on that if you're interested in IHL. I think the final thing that I kind of wanted to say about international law in Australia is like I said, it's a bit harder to get into international law in Australia just because we're so like secluded from the rest of the world, right? We're not Europe. But the flip side of that is once you like have your foot in the door, the like community is pretty small. So I feel like once you like know one person, they can like introduce you to like everybody else, and then sort of like getting jobs is like, oh, I actually know that person, and things like that. So I think, yeah, being part of the network really helps. So yeah, those are kind of my preliminary starting points. But if anyone ever wants to chat, please do reach out, because yeah, I don't know if I put everything on my list.
Yeah, there's always different, sometimes things will surprise you as well. Maybe even like more international relations type of, because that's very closely linked as well. Yeah, that's a really comprehensive list. It's a really good list, that. Yeah, because I was just thinking now, for people listening, is, say, getting into this kind of work, having, say, a law degree. So you got a Bachelor of Law. A lot of people, myself included, don't actually have a law degree. Like, we study international law, but not previously had any experience in sort of domestic law or anything. What's kind of the environment like that for that? For, say, students or individuals who don't come from, say, a particular legal background, but they may have knowledge of, say, international relations or international law?
I mean, I think it's still like, I don't think you necessarily need a law degree to get into like the international relations, international law space. So like even some colleagues in our team don't necessarily have a legal background, but they're engaging on like policy issues, right? And like international relations and operational issues, right? So I think having like that holistic understanding of yeah, how states interact, what the political climate is, I think is just as useful, as well as like knowing different languages and then and things like that. So I don't think it necessarily precludes anyone. And sometimes even like not having a law degree, but you like do a master's in like international relations or international law or something is as useful as well. I think it might be different if you like for like specific international law jobs, but I think because a lot of the jobs in international law is more like international relations adjacent, or it's like humanitarian advisors or like political advisors, I think it's a lot easier to transition. Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. So what would you like, what's next for you? What's the future look like? Do you have anything exciting coming up? There was mentioned, I think briefly talked about it in the emails, that you contributed advice on a board game.
Oh yeah. So in terms of what's coming up in the future, so yeah, like I only started at like Red Cross like a year ago, so I'd really like to see like where things go. I think sink my teeth into it a little bit more, because like it's so varied and so different. So I see where that goes, right? In terms of this board game, so what happened was my partner and I we were like stuck in Melbourne actually during the first lockdown, and we were like so bored, and we kept playing like this same board game over and over. And my partner, who like designs games in his spare time, because that's his hobby, was like, actually, why don't I just make my own board game? I have this idea in my head. So we spent like a night like cutting up little cardboard pieces of paper, and we made this like board game. And so we just played it for fun, but eventually we're like, why don't we like make this for real? So we started producing it sort of, and did like a whole Kickstarter, and like got artists involved, and like started like making a commercial board game. So it's called Star Eater, and it's about like spaceships like fighting each other like on a board, and not necessarily lots of international law that is in the actual game, but a lot of like the story of the board game is about like state relations and stuff like that. So there's like different teams in this game, and one of them is like from like a UN body. I think we're allowed to use them in like derivative flags, but yeah, and there's like some weapons that are like considered war crimes because they're like super heinous if you use them and stuff like that. So yeah, international law kind of plays a part in the board game, but only tangentially. And I've just been helping with some like designs and logistics and stuff. So yeah, it's called Star Eater, and I think it's kind of like, I think it's at the moment on a ship in the ocean, like 1,000 copies coming our way. So I guess I'm going to help sell some board games in the future, if that's.
That sounds so cool. I mean, I would 100% play that. It sounds very similar, I think, to Risk. I think, I'm not sure if that's the name, where it's sort of
Risk,
like consolidating power of different countries.
Oh yeah, I actually think I explained this game very poorly, because it's more like it's a mix between battleships and chess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like strategy and
yes.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah. where can people acquire the game once it comes?
Once it comes, I mean, I probably at like the board game stores once we get it in, and we have a website. So I don't want to plug my board game here. So I
think it sounds really interesting.
But yeah, that's just my like outside hustle.
Yeah, no, exactly. But it's cool because you're able to still use that knowledge a little bit with something else, something that, say, people would never thought of, to think, we can turn this into a board game maybe.
Just a little bit of flavor text, like it has nothing to do with the actual way the game works. But I was like, yeah, put some international law in there.
yeah, just sprinkle it in a little bit.
Yeah.
Good to start learning as well. Yeah, that's really great. So where can people, say, find you on social media or anywhere, or even contact details if people wanted to contact you about potential chats? And yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think you can probably find me on LinkedIn. As you know, I don't know anything about Twitter. I have one, but I don't use it. So I think I have it. I feel like it's like key to like all this international relations stuff, but still yet to figure it out. Hey.
Yeah, it's just not a great environment.
It's very true. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best one.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, it was such a great time chatting with you, and such an amazing career. I think our listeners are going to have a really take a lot of value out of your experience and your insights. So thank you so much for being our guest on this interview series that we're doing.
Thanks so much for having me, Caroline. It was nice to meet you, and yeah, anyone feel free to reach out. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.